like this. Huh? Oops. Okay. So my talk will be pretty much around similar topics, but I'm always addressing these things out of natural philosophy scope. So less from the concrete artifacts and practices, yeah, but a bit from top down. And the title that I want to give to the talk today is Nature in Nuptials. Nuptials means marriage, of course, but the German term is very interesting here because Hochzeit used to be a kind of a ceremonial framing that was not at all reserved to the marriage of couples, of human couples, of the different sexed couples. But eine Hochzeit was a general term for any kind of ceremonial where a third or something transcendent which intercepts or which kind of plays in between a dual relation is being acknowledged and celebrated. That's also why, especially in the myth, you have all these, no, it's clear how Prometheus and even Zeus and all the different persona, they were kind of a personification of natural powers. And they were all married. Yeah, they all had kind of household relations that would intersect, interfere, diffract, and so on, where you get this whole social life, this incredible social life that is presented in the myth. The social life of the gods and the social life of the humans, which are not unaffected by each other. No? So this is the peculiar thing. The angle with, that's why I called it a natural philosophy approach. The angle for everything that I want to talk about today is for me right now very well captured in this short citation by a philosopher which I like a lot, Michel Serres, who said in a kind of a almost on the side in a note, now if we implicated texts in our writing, we would see more works blossom. And this, I think, gives very straightforwardly this natural philosophy angle. A work is not the creation of an author. That is in how I'm interested in it. But works are something which they have a certain kind of evolution. Of course, they live on inspirations from people, but they're not, it's inadequate to speak of creativity as a property of the person who does it. So that's always this angle. So works, so one can, it becomes a bit like a gardening, no? So so if works can blossom, there is a kind of a caretaking involved to works which are already there and which do not exclude that the works can, in a kind of an evolutionary sense, spring in fresh forms, kind of evolve in things that they have not been, but they're not. This approach liberates us from this kind of, I perceive it always as a killer argument. Is it modern or is it traditional? No, is it new or is it old? Am I imitating or am I being genuinely me? Whatever that is supposed to mean. So it liberates a bit from these obsessions, and I feel very comfortable with that. I never heard Lutke speak about the continent of questions. I'm very fond of this idea and also of this turn with artifacts or objects as embodiments of questions. And it's such a strong gesture, I think, because it, in a similar way, like this natural philosophy approach, helps us to liberate from a certain obscenity that is always at stake in questioning. And today, we don't have a big, let's say, culture on how to avoid this. We have a very obscene culture in this sense. No? When you are trying to find support for a project, you need to get your question straight. That's what everybody asks of you first. What is your research question? How are you going to approach it? This here is a book. It's not that new anymore. I think it's about 20 years old or so. It's by, I'm not even sure what his disciplinary background is. It's quite a strange book. It picks up this speech act theory approaches in linguistics, and it interrogates what does the act of questioning actually entail. So this is from the book excerpt. You can see the scope of it. Was tut eigentlich ein Fragender? Or I can read it in English maybe. What does a questioner actually do? And what happens to the questioned person in the process? Whatever questions this author uses in his clever investigation, from such everyday ones as how are you, to do you love me, to such fundamental ones as does God exist, the result always confirms the basic thesis of the volume. Questioning exposes the interviewee. No? Also der Fragende wird bloßgestellt. Every question is about exposing the thing or the person that is being interrogated. And this, he says, is the core of what the term obscenity actually means. So it's not enough to say there's a violence involved with questioning, like we say today with interrogation. We know interrogation from police, I at least associated with that. No, you're interrogated, you're locked in a situation and there's no space to breathe. But the etymology of the term interrogation, for example, is beautiful. What it means is I'm lending a hand. But for us to get out of the deadlock, you need to take the hand. And together we can be lifted out. This is from interrogare. It's a beautiful, so if you start to take these words, which have such a kind of a technical, no, or a protocoled way of receiving it, if you start to look at the spectrum of their etymological richness, let's say, there's almost always something to take by the hand, no, and kind of get out. So this emphasis on etymology, or it's better to call it actually philology. So to say that concepts have a kind of a quickness. So words, languages are alive. It's not just what we place in them, but words themselves have a kind of a life that is, in a certain sense, transcendent to all the peoples, the humanities, the social groups, and so on. And this is this quickness that the language has. So language can help us. It can also destroy things, but it can also help. And it kind of lives from that in a sense that is just not, it cannot be contained in a polarity between nature culture. It cannot be contained, it cannot be as adequately addressed if we say everything is a social construction. Just as little as we can say, it would be so clear and plain if only social constructions could be kept outside, no? If it were a positivist language, one which is unambiguous and so on. So the beauty of nature in nuptials, if you want, is that there's always couplings. There's always a certain sense of contractuality at work in it. And the other thing which I like a lot about this approach is that it finds a certain peace with a term that today is also not appreciated much. No, it's like when we try to not straightforwardly tell somebody you're talking bullshit, we say, well, this is very abstract. No, so to be called abstract is everything but a compliment today. And I think this comes a lot from trying to proliferate this kind of hygienic, no? Is it socially constructed? Who is the author? Who takes responsibility? What is this person fighting for? Or what legitimates a scientist to say this is true, no? But abstracting in the sense of trying to co-accommodate. No? So ultimately, if you want this kind of couplings or the Hochzeiten to celebrate a certain heightening effect, a certain lifting up of things, not just the gravity of history. No, in the end, we are all going to die. Yes, we are. But before there is life, no? And to surrender the beauty that life can be, to the facts, to the existentialist facts that there is birth, and then for all we can know, that's it when we die. No? Why not flirt with ideas? Why not try to build respect for things we don't understand, in the sense that we try to co-accommodate with things that is not us, that we don't like, in the sense of, I know exactly what this feels like. I know exactly what this means. How can we co-accommodate? How can there be coexistence? And the only thing that can make this is abstraction. Because abstraction always means we allow for more of the entropy, no? Lutger's entropy picture, where then John Wayne comes out. So these entropies, they're relative to what you put into the pot, no? So for every pot, you can make a bigger pot. So in a way, if you affirm abstraction, it looks like, rather than solving a problem, you want to create a larger one. And it's true, in a certain sense, but not for the sake of making a larger problem, but for the sake of putting in some more chance, some more elements that is, for which we are not fully responsible, but also not responsible. Well, something like this, a kind of a Stimmung or an atmosphere, which is natural, philosophical. No? So it's a mixture, nature and culture. And a philosopher, another one whom I respect a lot, Katerina Kolosova, also in a kind of a side note to one of her talks, she just gave this characterization of abstraction, which puzzled me a lot, because she clearly meant it in an appreciative way. But perfection is also not something that people feel comfortable with today. No? To speak of the perfect or perfection, this is hubris. No? This is white male superiority. This is all these labels against which we fight today. Perfect. What should that be? But it's a verb, it's perfecting, and it has a super interesting, again, philological history. It has a connection to luxury, which also is not, I mean, we all seek it, but almost no philosopher praises luxury today. No, luxury goes with a capitalist, materialist, a consumer culture. It's the opposite of being sustainable. It's the opposite of trying to look for peace. It's to go for distinction and so on. But the Greek term for luxury is quite different. It's the term polyteleia. And polyteleia comes from poly, for many, and teleia, from teleos, from goals. So many goals that are embodied in one co-accommodation. No? Polyteleia, luxury, has to do with pursuing a kind of a heightening, if you want, or a lightness, or an elegance, or an aesthetic complexity, which does not try to proceed by making a hierarchical order, which is the most important goal and what is derivative to it. But it's a bit like in this idea of, there's a line to that, but it's a bit like in a marriage. No? In a marriage, it's a kind of a contract, it's a pact as well. It's not just a contract, it's a pact. We want to make a life together. No, and you cannot control that. The pact means none of the two sides will be per se superior. This is speaking mythically now, socio-democratically. So it has been different, of course, but I want to keep the natural philosophy angle. So there's something about luxury with abstraction and with perfecting, which is peaceful, not just making distinctions, putting in profile, classifying in hierarchies. And if we look at terms, so there is an old, actually it took me quite a while to note this, because it's so colloquial, cosmetics and cosmos. Yeah, they share the same wording. So the cosmos is not just the earth. It's also not just the world, if the world is what we can map, no, where we do geography, or the earth where you have the forces and the stratifications and the natural history for it. Cosmos means a model of earth and world, but a model that needs to communicate itself through adornment. So a cosmos can never be a representation of the principle of creation. That's what came into being with natural philosophy. That's what makes it different from a theology or from a religion. There's not a personal God, which the model would represent. No, like in the Bible, it's about being the image of God. The nature of the humankind, according to Christianity, is to be das Ebenbild sein, so to be the image. So God created humans in the image of himself. That's the story in Christianity. Cosmos is not like that. Cosmos is not like that as a term. The way how it was introduced in philosophy, the key text for this is also by Plato, but it's not the Republic, it's the Timaeus. And the Timaeus is a strange story which links a kind of principles, natural principles, with legacies that come from all sorts of different myths. So it gives a kind of an architectonics. It gives an architectonics of how, a model of how, if the creator, whatever, were the maker of the world, how would he have thought about what he makes? So this model of the architectonics, it follows like in mechanics. It has certain principles, but these principles, they release an infinite scope of expansion rather than limiting and giving determinism. So that's an interesting link. I will come back to this. But the cosmos means we cannot address anything in the world without adornment. Adornment is what can pacify, what can co-accommodate things. So that's why in aesthetics, in architecture, in all of these artistic things, you have values of styles, and then the styles which are almost religious, no? For the one, so it used to be before modernity. So the styles would accommodate the decorum, so the morals, the customs of a certain area where people were living. So it was a very serious thing. So there's a whole dimension to perfection, to luxury, and to refinement or perfecting in this sense, which is very different from a materialist consumer culture, no? Where we can just buy things if we can buy them without any kind of investment that concerns our persons. So that's an interesting background. The jewel itself is a term like that. So its etymology, so they say it's not true. And it's interesting, no? See, the joke or joy. So the joke, of course, is a kind of an ironic, ridiculizing thing. So a jewel, to say that the jewel comes from a joke, it's a very existentialist thing to say, but not in the sense of, so in the bad sense of existentialism. It's quite cynical. But the other term from which it's derived is joy. And joy is one of these feelings that is very powerful. And we know that nobody can give joy to somebody else, not in the spiritual, in the profound sense. Pleasure, it's another story, perhaps. No, but joy is something we can also not make us feel. So joy is something very powerful, and the jewel is a relation to that. There are many stories in the myth for this. So, for example, the zodiac with the constellations of the stars, it was thought of as a crown, of course, of jewels. And the story goes that Ariadne, Ariadne is this figure who helped, what was his name? Theseus, to find his way out of the labyrinth. So in the labyrinth, there was this monster contained, and somebody had to go fight the monster. But if he goes fight the monster, if he finds the monster, he will not come out back. So he will have to sacrifice himself. And Ariadne came up with the idea that just take this thread of a thread and faden, and lay out the path so you can come back. So that's what she's mainly famous for. And then the story goes that she happily got married with Theseus because he survived. But then, wow, Theseus leaves her. He brings her to this island and sails away. She's abandoned. And she meets Dionysus, the greatest gods. And Dionysus gets married with Ariadne. And this is so interesting because Dionysus is not just the god of the the kind of the material, the pleasure, the frenzies, and the not quite being of consciousness. He's also the god who comes from beyond the horizon to the west. Dionysos is not from the area in which he unfolds his meaning. He comes from elsewhere, just like Ariadne doesn't really have a home. Yeah. So, but that's why she stands for a method where there is no path. No? So method means a way to reach a goal, but she has neither a goal nor is there a way already there. This is Ariadne, and Odysseus, he comes from where nobody can imagine it. And the way that he comes and makes people be empathic and affectively related to each other, he weaves a kind of a fabric for a collectivity. No, with Dionysos, the individual counts very little. No? With Dionysos, the power comes from jointly feeling things, from feeling things that one alone cannot make happen. So this is a kind of a fabric and a thread out of this fabric. It's a marriage, again, a mythic marriage, Dionysos and Ariadne. So if we now look at the history, yeah, it's not the history, it's the spectrum, let's say. And I'm drawing all of this not from expert books. Huh? So this is Etym Online. It's an open, yeah, it's a kind of an open source and a public a database. It's not expert, it's more going to common sense. You have the interesting spectrum that to consume literally means to destroy by separating into parts, where the parts can no longer be reunited. No, if you have a living thing and you analyze it, it's dead. You cannot reanimate it. It's the Frankenstein story. So if knowledge goes through interrogation and questioning, it inevitably exposes to the degree that, well, the thing falls apart. And you cannot fix it together anymore. There's no, so because soul is not at stake, whatever we mean with soul. So there's a sense of destroying and of annihilation that comes with consumption. And that's clearly the sense that we, that we get very alert today. You know? So we have been consuming a lot in the 20th century in every sense of that word. So to use up, to eat, to waste. And in distinction to that, there is this word which is almost exclusively reserved to marriage. To consummate marriage means a relation which needs to be consummated. That's the kind of contractual sacredness that sex has in a marriage, according to the protocols of the ceremonials. No? The Geschlechtsakt, it's a kind of taking agency which never stops and which never takes one direction and which is iterative and so on. So to consummate, the marriage relation that lives from such a pact of coexistence is a relation which needs to fulfill itself through acts of consummation. And this consummation means it's not about, it's not just about the two people who are being married. It's about a transcendental third, respect for nature, you could say, or respect for love, or I don't know, any of these values, which we usually place in more in the field of religion, needs to be part of this act. Otherwise, there cannot be a consummation, because it means this consummation means one is not properly oneself. And that's something which is easier to imagine when we think of relations of intimacy. No? In intimate relations, we are vulnerable, we are exposed, but not in a bad sense necessarily, because we are not fully contained. We're not protected like otherwise. There's an openness and a kind of a mingling and a mixture in relations that we call intimate, which make this difficult wording quite, I think, relatable. No? So intimacy relations. And this is a bit, so I will come, I'm almost done with this building up of the terms. But what I would like to suggest is that you kind of think these things in constellation. So the nuptial is not the relation of the marriage. So that is kind of what is being framed in the stories I want to talk about. So the marriage relation, this kind of acts of consummation. But how does one celebrate this? No? And you can see there how there is a kind of an ordinary or an almost everyday rituality that comes with existential relations like this, where almost everything can be part of this acts of consummation. So the care that you give in preparing dishes, the care that you give in telling what you have experienced when you come back in. So it's a kind of a care that has a lot to do with a building up of a level of, you could say, immediate diplomacy. So you don't share immediately the brutalness of what has happened, but you frame it. You put care in how you put things such that it remains undecided to a certain extent. And it's a kind of a cultivation of things like that. And the nuptial has a lot to do with, it's like a name for ceremonies that try to give a face to these ordinary practices. So a nuptial is the wedding ceremony. So everything that pertains to marriage, a wedding from nupta to marry, of uncertain origin. Here it's the interesting part. Nubere literally means to cover, to veil oneself. No? So a relation which is supposed to be the most intimate, so a kind of a safe space for an intimate relation, is celebrated as something where one is veiling oneself. That's very odd, no? Where one is inevitably always covered. So it's not about exposing the naked truth or seeking the naked beauty or things like that. It's about taking care of coverings that furnish, if you want, a domain of an oikos, of a household, of a shared social space. And the fabric of making these covers, and this is where I think it's really actually a powerful narrative to address this question of code. Because what coding does is it veils things inevitably. Now we can code anything in 1,000 ways, but it matters a lot how we do that. So code is something like the transparent means that every act of speaking or writing or drawing, it depends upon. But as soon as we would put it to the foreground, the beauty of what is drawn or written or said loses its strength, no? Because it's like the secret of what gives it power is being revealed, but it's just coded, no? Either this, or in the other extreme, and this is actually the way how code is still addressed in a not just a technical and an engineering way, but in a cultural way, in cryptography and in the law, the code and the codex is quite sacred. No? So it's something which we don't touch. No? And this it will not add up. It's too drastic. It's like separating nature from culture. So code is there everywhere. And of course, in different ways. And of course, the authority of code is different depending on the informedness of people who do it and on many things. So that's a kind of, so to relate it to relations of marriage, of this kind of co-accommodative, consumative activity. No? So it's an activity which will not immediately see what it is capable to produce. It's an activity in a way which has much more to do with another topic to which I will come shortly, that is related to the or that we can relate, and I think we should relate, to how we think of data. Because data literally means the givens, no? That which is given. But just like it's hard to address what the role of code is in mathematics, for example, or what the role of code is in syntax, or in semantics, or in cinematography, or wherever you want, just as difficult is it to, now I lost my thread. What was I saying? Before the code, data, the givens. What is it that gives the givens? No? How do we get data? So it's clear today that we do it by measurement. Okay, but that does not really give us an answer, does it? Because just like we can code things in 1,000 ways, we can measure things in 1,000 ways. So measures need to be adequate to the things that they are applied to. No, the most brutal, that's the brutality of money, because money is used as a measure and it's generic. It applies to, yeah, really more or less everything in today's world. And it's generic. So there is no proportioning with money, not per se. So it's a way of measuring and of giving data that, yeah, it's very brutal in the way that it unfolds. It can be, but on the other hand, it also is what produces esteem and valuation of luxury, for example. No? So it's always both. But there's a way, and there are interesting people I want to show you a little, and Camus is one of them, to relate these givens, also das Gegebene, die Daten, to the gift. And the gift is something that most of the philosophers in the 20th century were insisting on saying it's any possible fantasy. No? Because a gift has, yeah, how to say, a gift can only be a gift if it doesn't involve any sort of reciprocity. No? If one gives a gift to somebody, it's only a gift if I don't expect anything as coming back. As soon as I do, it becomes a kind of a trade relation. It becomes a kind of an exchange. It becomes commercialized. And yet, all the cultures have ceremonies of gift giving, which were pragmatically doing things differently than economic relations do. No? So, and again, it's the beauty of this natural philosophy approach. Natural philosophy approach never seeks how to get it purely straight. Wherever there is a point of an aporia, no, where you cannot get out, let's saturate the situation with more ambiguity. So with the gift, there can be, and I think there should be, new narratives of storytelling that can relate to a notion of abstraction in this sense, no? In this sense that I was talking about. So concretely, and this was the idea that was then also attributed to the Timaeus, to this book, you know, the first architect, who speaks about world making in a mythical and yet in a scientific way. That what this treatise actually conveys is, of course, all the formulations, all the constellations, all the symmetries, all of these things. But on a gestural level, it's inviting to be imitated in a constellation where the imitation does not compete with the one who imitates, does not compete with the original, no? The one who is being imitated. But this role that should be imitated, that of the architect, according to the Timaeus, the better you learn to imitate it, the more rewarding it gives you gifts. Yeah, so this is the idea. So you can learn from somebody who is able to do things that you are not, in a way that is rewarding for you without making, impoverishing or kind of using up or consuming the source where it's coming from. So this is a relation of imitation, which has very little to do with copy and original or representation and precision in the representation. It has everything to do with adequacy. And adequacy is something that remains singular to a relation that, in this generalized sense, we could say is a relation of consummation. So there's a kind of, this is an old theme, thinking and a certain kind of erotic, so a desire, no? Cannot really be separated. If one doesn't have this good luck with not getting bored, no, and annoyed with all these difficult texts. This is an intricate play of seduction, of desire, of trying to get attention, trying to give attention, trying to kind of awaken things, and so on. The whole hermeneutic spectrum lives from a kind of an erotics, which is intelligible, of course, but it's also, and it can be also quite sensual, quite bodily. So a relation between thinking and the body will fall in this scenario just as much as the one between nature and culture, or between, for that matter, and here I will complicate a bit what Ludger was saying with the marriage of the light and matter. Also this duality. Because on a certain level, light and matter are actually the same. Yeah. So if you ask a quantum physician, there would be photons and mass. So now we could say the photons are light and mass is matter, but it's not quite true, because mass only manifests if it absorbs and reflects light. Light, in any way that it is accessible to us, is only present when it plays in between material things. So this kind of quantum oscillation, is it a particle or is it a wave? Well, it's both. And that means in a certain way it's the same thing, even though it's not representable in the same way. And I'm saying this because the story of Camus has been published in German, and I'm not sure if this is actually Camus' wording or if these were the editors. I don't know. But it puzzled me a lot, and it really brought me on the path that I'm talking to you about now a lot. Hochzeit des Lichtes, how can that be? No, it's not Hochzeit. It's not a marriage between two things. It's a Hochzeit, so a marriage relation of light. So it's a kind of it affirms, if you want, tautology, or self-reference, or recursive, a kind of a recursiveness that is at stake. Hochzeit des Lichtes. So light, what could that be? Light in relations of consummation with itself. Yeah. So it's, the more I think about it, the more important I find it, because it keeps in our scope a notion of the universal, which as well will not be represented. It's not about representing and clarifying the universal. It's more like, if you want, for me, it's an idea. So where does this third element that always intercepts, that is supposed to kind of keep the relations active? Where is it coming from? And it's quite nice, I think, to say, well, it's because it's universal. And universal means it contains everything we can know. So not more nor less. And people have been thinking about this because it becomes accessible then through music, primarily, much more than, so whereas this mimesis and copy and original and representation and duplication and so on, this is all inspired by seeing, by vision, by the eye. This kind of circularity and self-referentiality, it finds its graspable phenomena through music much more. And this here is a citation from a beautiful and a very, very strange book by Balzac. It's in the 19th century, and it's so interesting because Balzac is one of these so-called realist authors. So he was fed up with kind of praising the old motifs and telling stories in a literate way, so in a literally educated way. He was observing the lives of the people. He wanted to give a voice to the things that would never manifest in high art, in literature, and so on. But then he also wrote this very strange text, which is called Seraphita. From the Seraphite is an angel. I forgot which one and what kind of exactly, but it's some kind of light being. And he kind of picked up this motif to address topics and themes of androgyny. And this kind of marriage of light. So light with itself. It gets interesting because it can co-accommodate notions of the androgynous. The androgynous is neither nor, but it's also not everything in between. It's everything in everyone. No? The androgynous. So one path that I start to find very interesting because of an exchange with my colleague for der Bestand, Konservierung, Denkmalpflege. The Bestand, it's a super interesting term in German because as a Bestand, it has a materiality as a term. No, it's how do we relate to heritage as a kind of a material practices, whereas the English name for Bestand is heritage. But heritage manifests as patrimony. And patrimony is literally kind of the stock, no, that needs to be kept alive, the stock of values. But if we now fold in the nuptials and the marriage, we have the matrimony to complement the patrimony, because in order to keep the patrimony alive, we need matrimony. So we need relations, economical relations, householding relations of how to socialize this heritage. And this mixture, it's almost a new materialist kind of perspective, is totally present also in the literature, in the German literature on Denkmalpflege, with this notion of the Bestand, and it's totally eclipsed in the English. It's interesting. And it's also interesting to relate this to this theme of the androgynous, that if we generalize heritage from kind of, say, keeping a cultural identity safe or a certain historical story, preserving a certain historical storyline, if we think of heritage in a natural philosophy way, it's our DNA. Everything that has ever had life, since ever, is inscribed in the DNA of everything. No? Men and women. Yeah. Men and women. So the DNA is a kind of a patrimony which just does not apply to the gendered roles anymore, and also not to the biological sexes. So salamanders have heritage. Yeah. So there really is a kind of a materiality which needs a different way of addressing than one that leads to kind of consumption. But how can we attend to materiality in a way that would not be driven by consumption, but by consummation? This is the interest I take in this. And what Balzac wrote here is just one excerpt, but it's a firework. It's an explosion of ideas which are they're all about light and about this transcendence, but they're all a little bit dirty. They're all a little bit polluted. They're never pure, and that's what makes them actually tolerable, to me at least. This kind of Lichtwesen literature, it's unbearable, I find. And he begins to link it to practices, and that's interesting. So practices can relate to a kind of a material culture in such a way which wouldn't go to consumption, but not if it is oriented towards products, products which will be goods, which will have to circulate, which will have particular tasks, but a refinement of something that also strives for perfecting a little more. So what he writes here, light gave birth to melody and melody to light. You see the recursion. So here as well, so there's not one is the father and one is fathering and one is giving birth. It's a different kind of mechanics. Colors were both light and melody. Motion was number endowed by the word. In short, everything was at once sonorous, diaphanous, and mobile, so that everything exciting in everything else, extension knew no limits, and the angels could traverse it everywhere to the utmost depth of the infinite. This is really a bit like an introduction of the theme which the existentialist writers then will celebrate a lot, especially Camus. So I have here a short excerpt. You already read a passage, but there is one that I like a lot because it really makes graspable how this existentialism in Camus goes to a kind of cosmic intimacy. It seeks a kind of a cosmic intimacy, an intimacy which is not an intimacy between persons. So he writes, those who need myth are indeed poor. Here, in the nameless temple of TIPASA, the gods serve as beds or resting places as the day races across the sky. I describe and say, this red, this blue, this green, this is the sea, the mountain, the flowers. Need I mention Dionysos to say that I love to crush mastic bulbs under my nose? Is the old hymn that will later come to me quite spontaneously, even addressed to Demeter, happy is he alive who has seen these things on earth? How can we forget the lessons of sight and seeing on this earth? All men had to do at the mysteries was watch. Yet even here, I know that I shall never come close enough to the world. I must be naked and dive into the sea, still scented with the perfumes of the earth, wash them off in the sea, and consummate with my flesh the embrace for which sun and sea, lips to lips, have so long been sighing. I feel the shock of the water rise up through a thick, cold glue, then dive back with my ears ringing, my nose streaming, and the taste of salt in my mouth. As I swim, my arms shining with water flash into gold in the sunlight until I fold them in again with a twist of all my muscles. The water streams along my body as my legs take tumultuous possession of the waves, and the horizon disappears. You see, thinking, embodiment, situativeness, universality, it's all mixed in a very intense, very existential, in a way naked, but at the same time always veiled a kind of way. And that's, for example, a huge difference to the writings of Jean-Paul Sartre, who was much more, not with the cosmos, but with the social. No, in Sartre, this kind of intimacy comes as well, but it manifests as disgust. So the more existentialist you become in the thinking of Sartre, the more you follow there, the more the world starts to disgust you. He has written a novel titled Disgust, which it's just almost unbearable to read because it's so effective and it's so true. But why should it be followed more than a kind of a peace gesture in these things? What would make it more true or more moderate or more modest or whatever? It's just another scale. So Camus and this Hochzeit des Lichtes. So I'm saying this also because it has, I think, the potential to find a different relation to technical objects. No? So technical objects today, the way that we relate to them is either very much as a kind of a means to an end. So we try to keep it very pragmatic, not to be puzzled why these things work. So why, through optical fiber cables, our speech is coded into light and then decoded back into acoustics again, anywhere in the world, real time. This is just, I mean, who is not amazed if one really pictures this? It's crazy, no? And it's physics. It's also metaphysics, undoubtedly, no? Because nobody can explain exactly why. We then say, well, it's the synchronicity that comes with light, if we think light is photons, but, and so on. And then it goes on and on and on. So if we allow this kind of marveling, we cannot feel so safe with the technical objects as we do today. Yeah? So, and then how to address them. And I've been thinking for a long time how to think of, so Michel Serres, he makes a lot of stories about saying, yes, time goes linear, but it also goes circular in the spiral. And the spiral has something to do with taking a path which always goes up and down. So if you go up, you can proportionately go down. And if you go down, you can proportionately go up. And I like this very much as an abstract idea, but it was very hard to imagine what does it actually mean or what can it mean? So, okay, simply, if we deal with the past, we can better anticipate the future, but we all know that this is not true. No, not per se. it plays a role, but it doesn't guarantee. So it's not just like that. But one thing that becomes beautiful with this is to say, well, technical objects manifest a kind of a becoming that goes against time. No, it's not a becoming that goes with time. It's a becoming that goes counterstream to time. If time would be the historical, the evolutionary path. A technical object manifests, and this is now the term I want to come to, an act of uncreation. Uncreation. Uncreation is a word which comes from Simone Weil. Probably not originally, but she made, she gave a big importance to this term. And uncreation is not the same like annihilation or like destruction. But you can imagine how difficult it is to find words which can make this distinction. So it's really a kind of a jewel, if one manages. It can also become something very ugly. I will show you in a moment. But she was concerned with this in this book. It's not a book that that she gave this title to. It's posthumously published. It's writings that are collected by her. She died very, very young, I think in her 30s, and very tragically. But the idea that she was pondering is, yeah, perhaps best grasped here. She says, all the natural movements of the soul are controlled by laws analogous to those of physical gravity. Grace is the only exception. And you know, gravity is not just one physical force. Gravity is the one physical force which systematizes all the others. This is Newton. This was the big turn with modern physics, to systematize all the mechanical devices or cunnings into a deducible and logical order. This was only possible with the assumption of gravity. So gravity is, Newton himself, he said, he thinks of gravity as the skin of God, because the skin is the most complex perceptive organ that we have. So that was his metaphor. So she says the soul has something as scientific like nature. It's organized by laws which work like those organized by gravity. But then there is an exception, which she calls grace. Grace is not contained in this. And she says she will always relate to it. So grace is not really a human feeling. Grace is a kind of a superhuman, I think she always calls it, superhuman cause or something like that. Yeah, supernatural, she says. So we must always expect things to happen in conformity with the laws of gravity, unless there is supernatural intervention. And then she says, so how would we even recognize supernatural intervention? She says, the two forces that rule the universe are light and gravity. And here you see photons and mass. No? Mass is the weight. And it's also interesting, the sun, which is a pure luminous thing, is also the stellar body of the greatest weight in the galaxy. So the sun, which is purely light, has the greatest weight at the same time. So these things is what she is talking about. And then saying, so her claim is a little bit, grace is something supernatural, but also in the natural things, we cannot find anything unless we are receptive and kind of respectful to whatever it is, this exception, no, grace. So the idea is a bit that if gravity systematizes everything, grace isn't an outside of that. Grace is something that can unsystematize everything, but not in the sense of imposing another systematicity, no, or breaking it or producing chaos, but as a kind of an interceptive activity, which in my understanding, so the way that I kind of picture this constellation, so then grace is something that we can think of in these relations of consummation. So acts that are not meant to stop, and yet, yeah. So, and if we now look at more recent literature, where people try to make sense of this of technicality in a more complex sense, in a more philosophical sense. One of the very important people there is Gilbert Simondon, and he has a remarkable passage about Le Corbusier. He says, the monastery by Corbusier is a beautiful example of the contribution of the technical mentality in architecture. It includes within its plan its proper line of extension. Here you see, this is Ariadne and Dionysos. Huh? It includes within its plan its proper line of extension for a further enlargement. And this is possible not only because of the architectural conception of the whole, but also because of the spirit of paring down that manifests itself in the choice of forms and the use of materials. It will be possible, without any break between the old and the new, to still use concrete, shuttering, iron, cables, and the tabulature of long corridors. So you see how there's a kind of a crafting, a material practices, which is brought about by a technical mentality, but which has a lot to do with this kind of wailing in the service of perfecting further. No? So perfecting doesn't mean making new. It means picking up what is there and trying to raise it, to augment it, if you want, inventively. So even though all these grand words with the light and the transcendence and so on, it really manifests in quite material, quite graspable and concrete practices. And that's what he calls technical mentality. And this technical mentality is something different from a personal intentionality, no, or the aim of a project, or the I don't know, any of these measurable frameworks. Another person whom I also like a lot is Yu Kui. He wrote, I think, several books on what he called cosmotechnics. So he would pick up these old stories of the architect of the cosmos, but he wants to generalize it to techniques. So not because the architect has this arche, no, which is complicated to deal with, of course. There are a lot of analogies and kind of resonances. And especially what is interesting in his approach is he says, and this is a bit like when Lutke says objects embody questions. No? So what animates objects in their agency is the questions that they embody, that they incorporate. And it's an objectivity of questions. It's not this kind of interrogative, violence into intimate relations. It's a kind of exposing publicly. So in the object, things can be publicly exposed in an immediate way to oneself. No? And he says technical objects have a soul, and these are the objects that remain. And the objects that remain is a phrase which is a bit cryptic. What it literally means is this is the eschaton. So if you are a bit familiar with theology, you have apocalypse and you have eschatology, basically. Apocalypse means the revelation. No, it's the last moment where things are clear, and the ones who see it, they're chosen, no? For the beyond of the apocalypse. And the eschaton is the same mechanics, but from outside in, if you want, or inside out. It depends on where you start from. The eschaton literally means the things that remain. That's what the word eschaton means. So the last things that remain. So you have with the apocalypse, you have a kind of a social identity story, a personality. With the eschaton, it's the things. So he says objects will be things that remain. And then the question, of course, is, and so this has a lot to do with this quest for thinking an existentialist nothing, which is not a nihilistic one, no? Which I think was part of what Weil wanted to address as decreation. There is a contemporary poet, and her I can really just recommend very, very warmly. She's called Anne Carson. She's teaching in New York, and she wrote a collection of texts, interestingly, poetry, essays, and an opera, which contains an ode. Actually, it's an aria, not an ode, that she wrote imagining what Simone Weil might have had in mind. And I think it helps a lot to kind of picture for me what she did not have in mind. But still, no, it kind of is a telling practice. She says in its aria, so she imagines Simone to sing this alone in an empty place. So in this existentialist nothing. I am excess, flesh, brain, breath, creature who breaks the silence of heaven, blocks God's view of his beloved creation, and like an unwelcome third between two lovers, gets in the way. It is creation that God loves, mountains and sea and the years after, blue simple horizon of all care, world as it is when I am not there. No? You see the struggle. This is the existentialist struggle. So what is hateful or what is to be resented about a kind of a religious affirmation of the divine is that, what's my place here? No. So nature is beautiful. All I can do is disturb it. No. So this is the sentiment. Undo this creature is her call. Excess, flesh, brain, breath, creature. Undo this creature. So this goes against the creation and the nature as a kind of a creature. And if you're a bit familiar, I'm just giving you indexes, no? So because these things are so abstract, they can be vivid in so many ways that you can see how people are pre-concerned with that. This here is a paper which discusses the term, the use in the literature of Giorgio Agamben. You know, he's again a very different temperament. But what comes out, so when you work with texts like this, like Lutke said, I would also recommend, don't try to understand, no? So beginning and only continue once you feel you get it. No, read it all and start to mark up what kind of makes sense and pick up these fragments that are talking to you and start to relate them to others which are also doing that. And then you can build hypotheses, you can go back to the text and it will start to work more and more and more. Or you get totally allergic, but that means it's actually a strong text usually. So Agamben, for example, his discontent with this is, he says, one cannot consider the artist's work uniquely in terms of creation, because at the heart of every creative act, there is an act of decreation. That's how he brings it in. A creative act means decreating what exists, decreating the real, being stronger than the fact in front of you. Every act of creation is also an act of thought, and an act of thought is a creative act because it is defined above all by its capacity to decreate the real. Now, this, in a way, almost reads like a description of what a technical artifact is supposed to do. No? A technical artifact gives us more strength than we have. It allows us to shorten time. It allows us to combine weights in ways that are not possible to combine before, and so on. So it's interesting. Then she works out what might be the poetics behind. I will come back to this use of the term poetics in a moment. What might be the poetics at work in Agamben's engaging with this? And she says that it's like saving what has never been realized. So it's a term of potentiality in Agamben. So not just the possible and the actual and the real, but to say, well, God chose not to realize certain things that he could. And this kind of repository, this is what his way of working with the term wants to save, no? To preserve. And that's very different from Whale. But maybe this gets too detailed now. So, but I recommend I can also upload the text I'm referencing. It's very interesting to follow on this level, to follow argumentation, because this is really argumentation, not in the sense I want to be confirmed in what I have always thought to be right. This is really argumentation that goes further and further, where in principle we get afraid, no? Where we talk about things that not only we cannot know, but nobody can know. So what would be the purpose of even talking about it? No, it's very different to the Wittgenstein sentiment, with what we cannot know, we should not speak about. No. So, but it's I would call this Orphic quests. That's where I want to end in a moment. Are you still fine? A little bit more, huh? Okay. So one simple way to think of this decreation creation is to think of it like with a mechanism. No, with a mechanism, we have a simple definition of what a mechanism is, apart from all the specifics of the different mechanics. It means we can say something is a mechanism if when we follow it, it produces a certain effect, which we can also undo by undoing it. No, we can lift, but we can also lower. So a mechanism is something which always entails the control over the doing of something that gives us the control of undoing what we have done. This is what we usually reserve for what we call a mechanism. But now to take a mechanic view upon this idea of acts that are somehow producing world, let's say, the beauty of it, I think, for me, is that it links us with a natural philosophy point of view. So a mechanic will never fight with another mechanic that his mechanism and his application will be more true than that of another. No, they will exchange about the capacities of a certain mechanics. So it depends whether you do it in the complex number domain or in the rational number domain, for example. The mechanism can be similar, but where you can apply it depends a lot in what kind of mathematics that you allow to inform it and so on. So the mechanisms are not in a relation of competition to one another. But that means the cunning or the craft in working as a mechanic is almost the opposite of what I at least have still learned. No, for a mechanic, things are always determinate. He knows when he succeeds. And this is gone when we allow mechanics to apply to this kind of perfecting. Because it can work very well, but it can imply things that nobody has wanted. No? And that's a problem which almost gives us a circumscription of what we today mean with complexity of things, no? And systems effect and so on. And they're all triggered by recursion, they're all triggered by self-reference, they're all triggered by circularity and by interference of spheres, which we have thought they remain untouched. So there's almost an ethical, I find almost an ethical duty to re-attend to mechanics as something very, very artistic and something very daring, actually. Because it follows the rules, which it doesn't, if you want to fight the mechanism, well, what can you do? Well, you can, I don't know, bump your head in the wall a million times, but for what? No, except for narcissistic reasons. So you accept a certain determinism, you accept a certain necessity without feeling impoverished by it. No, it's not humiliating that the mechanism works. I mean, for many people it is actually, but that's a kind of a disproportionateness of a human self-understanding. So one shouldn't, this is really silly, no, to feel offended by the things which work like that. But that doesn't mean that these things determine what we can do with them. So it's a kind of a coexistence and a thinking with technology that produces what these people are talking about when they speak of technical mentality and technical objects as having a soul or as embodying the questions of everybody who projects into their ideas into them. So then, but how to think of the thinking that goes into this? Because it's, of course, people invent. No, that's the thing with mechanics and with mathematics. They don't just show themselves. People have to kind of, it's always, werden die Sachen gefunden oder erfunden? No? In the mathematics. So are they there and are they just discovered or are they invented? And again, the beauty of such an ethics of nuptiality, if you want, of acts of consummation, is that they're both. So you enter this kind of intimate relation that is existential by veiling yourself and things. So they're both. But then the question is how to address this agency. So if it's not the objects which act on us, no. So that's also a kind of quite a popular narrative today, that people start to feel threatened by all these devices. So they're fighting back. It's a kind of a magic worldview in the negative sense, or for some, I guess, also in a positive sense. But one way of addressing it, and this comes here, it's a saying that I was very fond of citing from Michel Serres for a long time, but I was not aware that it was actually also coined by a pragmatist philosopher, William James. And it's a formulation with the fourth person singular. So we should say, it thinks like we say it rains. Who is the agency of that? There is clearly an agency. It's not some kind of fact that comes out of nothing. There is a lot to understand about it, but it cannot be wielded in just exactly the same way. And this here is, you see, it's an interesting text because it shows how through a kind of a scientific attitude that would think of the scientist or of the queering mind, let's say, in these things, as a subject or as a self in this fourth person singular, it can combine or bring in constellation anarchism with pragmatism. This I find very interesting. No, anarchism has this destructive potential, of course, but it also has a hopeful potential. Pragmatism, totally corrupt, but at the same time, very much with the things and in touch with a kind of a moderateness that goes on. In this case, it's a text about earth science and climate and so on. Yeah, okay. The it thinks. And then, the thing with the gift and the timeus, I think, mentioned. So the idea, it's basically, this is a beautiful text that I can recommend to you. It's by Marcel Henaf, and it's on the notion of the gift. And it attends to all of the 20th century, because the gift was a very popular topic among the philosophers in the recent decades. And almost all of them said it's a human-centric narcissistic myth, the gift. It's an impossibility. And Henaf says, no, it's actually an ethical necessity to insist that something like gifts are there. But gifts have nothing to do with properties. So we cannot even plan to make a gift. No, it's like moments when it's possible to give a gift to somebody. We don't really make them. And he describes, he gives a kind of a reading through all of the major positions, and then in the end bringing it to something I find quite beautiful. He says, yes, it shares a lot with phenomenology, when we say we need to attend to the phenomena, but not in order to grasp the phenomena in a sober way, in an unobstructed way as possible, but we need to attend to the phenomena in a way where we veil it, so we fashion it such that the phenomenon can be lifted up to fit in and to help co-accommodating certain other things which could not find support if these phenomena were not attended to like that. No? So it doesn't keep the distinctions between fact and fiction, or science fiction versus or construction versus pure observation. All of these are mixed in together, and when you work and attend to phenomena like that, it's an ethical responsibility of how you will do this. So that's a bit the outcome of it. But what it allows is to find a relation to mimesis, which is not so humiliating. No? So, because of course we don't want to imitate just somebody or someone else. There is a kind of a humiliation involved with mimesis, but it goes away if we say mimesis is what unlocks the reception of gifts. That's very different from Mimesis is what allows me to be what I am not. From looking it abschauen, yeah. This funny term, abschauen. But you see how magical this, if you think about it, how should that work? Abschauen, ich kann etwas abschauen. So I take the spirit out of what I look at. So it's, you know, this kind of metaphysical things, then they have never been gone away. They're always there. We just got used to them in a certain way. So why not in others? And I think this idea, so I don't want to interfere with the studio setup, but I would strongly recommend not to build a villa or a temple for Camus. Think of how to imitate Camus as somebody who can give you gifts that you want to pass on in the temple. More something like that. I would not bring it to a social dynamic story. But it's difficult. Huh?
I agree.
Yeah, that's why I dare to say it. So now some wedding stories to end. This is a really fantastically beautiful book by Roberto Calasso, Marriage of Cadmus and Harmony. It's a treasure book for sources about myths and figures. And I would recommend you to look at many of them. So look at least at, I don't know, 25. Don't just go for 2. Like the most famous ones that you mentioned are actually almost the most cliche ones. Prometheus and Penelope and Pandora, because they're so moral in their, so there is such a straightforward moral to their stories. So I think in order to, you should maybe treat them like you can treat Camus. No, don't name them directly, but learn how to address them in ways that where this morality gets a bit more complex. And it's actually the box of Pandora was a wedding gift. And this is another story too. So if the temple is about nuptials, so it's the ceremony of the marriage. How do you celebrate the ceremony of the marriage? No, not the place of the holy act or of the vow that you give, but the ceremony. So the nuptials. The mitgift is interesting. The dowry, it was called. No, and there are cultures where the dowries go also from the male to the female. So it don't always bring it to the gender stereotypes. Think of it in a natural philosophy way. And the book which does this in really a super remarkable way, it was one of the books in before Renaissance. Don't remember in which year. It's Martianus Capella. He was one of the first pre-Renaissance scholars who wanted to make something like public and popular education. So he wanted to break with the idea that if you want to become a literate mind, you need to go spend time in the monasteries because the monasteries have the libraries. So he wrote this book, this fantastic book, which is called The Marriage of Philology and Mercury. And you see, Mercury is the god of many, but especially the god of war. So it's about politics. It is not about kind of realizing myself in my private spare time. This is serious, no? But then also philology. Philology knows everything, but you cannot grasp philology. So the two get married. And in describing the marriage, he introduces what the 7 liberal arts have to teach. And the 7 liberal arts is the trivium and the quadrivium. So in the trivium, you have the language oriented, you have grammar, you have rhetorics, and you have dialectics. And in the quadrivium, you have the mathematics. You have geometry, you have astronomy, you have music, harmonics, and you have arithmetics. And these difficult topics are dressed up into storytelling in the wedding of these 2 figures, because they are the mitgift that philology brings into the relation of their marriage. And this mitgift is thought about as if it's some, I don't know, a good bag of apples and people want it. And in making it the object of conflicted desires, he can accentuate huge nuanceness about the beauty and also the danger of these different liberal arts. And it's, wait, I think I have an excerpt. Yeah, here. It has been translated into German. Not sure if I trust, yeah, but okay. So der du, so weiß man zu erzählen, zum Brautgemach die Zither spielst, denn eine Musenmutter soll geboren haben, verehrungswürdig Liebesband der Götter, der du mir mit unsichtbaren Fesseln schnürst fest den Widerstreit der Elemente und hegst mit heiliger Umarmung auch Dinge, die sich der Vereinigung wehrten. Du bindest ja die Elemente wechselweise, gattest die Welt. Den Hauch des Geistes einst du mit dem Körper in hochwillkommenem Bunde, dem gemäß Natur sich gatte, erwärmst du die Geschlechter füreinander und stiftest unter Mantel des Verlangens das Vertrautsein. Now you see how this text is light-hearted storytelling about all these kind of constellations that we were talking about. And it does this just as masterfully when it praises. It's always about praising everything. No? But in order to praise it, you also need to kind of know. So if what you want to praise is creative, you need to know how it is decreative as well. So that's where the nuanceness is coming from. Yeah, so the dowry. The dowry might be a good way. What would be, yeah, the dowry of these figures that you want to celebrate? And he is Martianus Capella. This is a really nice example. So it's about, in a certain way, the realization of the spirit. The spirit is das Geistige, yeah, let's say. We don't need to, it sounds so churchy in the English wording. But also the spiritualization of the real. No? That's what is at stake with the gift. When you have the phenomena, but you will saturate it, you will enrich, you will dress it up. There's no such thing as a pure thing. You cannot attend to a pure thing. So then, how to do that? And this kind of storytelling is a way where one can temper one's own intentions, because that's very hard to do, especially in language, no? To write in a way that will not, as fast as it can, jump to what it is that you really want to say. And if you do that, what you are able to say is usually quite stereotypical, not very literary, or super dogmatic. So these are all practices of formation, if you want, Bildungspraktiken oder sowas, which are not competing with the institutional ones, but kind of coexisting. Just like we shouldn't compete with AI, we should coexist with it. And to end, I want to show you a bit how what that can feel like to take such a stance in the fourth person. It's a passage from, it's also reconnecting with the liberal arts tradition. It's a passage from this book by Michel Serres, La Musique. And he says, so he kind of reinvents the story of the muses. The muses, if you want, are put in the service of polyteleia. So of the many goals, or of luxury, no? In the complex sense I was saying. And what he gets is a muse which is called polyhymnia. So yes, you adore things and you write hymns, so praises, but always poly. So many things that are being praised in one speech. Wow, how do you do that? It gets very difficult immediately. And he says, polyhymnia is the first muse which can teach you. He says, the quiet, supple, feline, studious first muse, fascinated by imitation, begins the work of the 9 sisters. There are 10 muses in his approach, by first of all inventing rhythm, whose repetitions can only line up and whose thrusts only begin again and whose beats only continue when they take place in a presence, in the face, in a specular image. Reflection then, doubling. Facing everything, polyhymnia's body duplicates people and everything else, imitates them, or better still, becomes all the things of the world. On the lookout for signs it can reproduce. Simulation in space produces simultaneity in duration. The first brings the second with it and immediately displaces it. First 2 gestures in the same bar, then one and the same gesture in 2 bars, double imitate. Double repeat, 1 foot, then 2 feet. Then for successful imitation, start again from the beginning. Imitate, then reproduce. And these muses, they educate a scholar which he calls the Orphic scholar, so to be Orpheus, basically. Orpheus was the figure, you know, who first of all enchants everything he looks at, but then he gets married and his wife dies and he is only sad. And then he is allowed to go into Hades and bring his wife back to life under the condition that he does not look back if she follows. So he was promised, she will follow you, but he didn't trust the words. So he looked back and it was lost. This is the tragic story of Orpheus. So it's a question of words, trust, enchantment, but also love, ethics, everything. Yeah? And he says this should be, so to kind of go notice, if you go up the spiral, you need to go down. If you go down the spiral, you can go up. So if you want something which is lifting, you need to dive deep. That's the idea in a simple way that what he is pursuing. So don't move on the surface, no, and claim a little bit more territory here and fight a little there. Dive deep and go high. And the muses, they are what can instruct such an Orphic scholar. The second muse, which helps to make more clear what the first muse is supposed to do with this rhythm and the repetition. The second muse is called Terpsichore. And of her, he says, infected by the rhythm, the second muse starts dancing just as smoothly and nimbly. She no longer reproduces something like her sister, who is almost like a pantomime, but discovers and invents the body, humanizes it. In dance, she throws herself into unimaginable, unexpected and new positions, movements, contortions, tensions, leaps, bacon, and gestures that neither walking, running, hunting, nor any other vital function would require. By freeing life from its native prison, Terpsichore creates a life even fuller and more colorful than the courtship dance of, I don't know, the round dance of bees or the vagabonding of whales in the ocean's depths, sending out calls of attraction. Yes, the dance collects a bundle, a repertoire, a reservoir of bodily forms. This is this kind of saturation of stocking up, which is not a rational ground, no, that then needs to be administrated and can be used up. It's this kind of thing that, that it's a cornucopian economy, if you want. So when you imitate something, everything gets richer. Yeah, so this is the dynamics. And there are 10 muses, he describes them all. I just have these two parts here. And this is what I would like to call Orphic quests. And there are, if you have this, yeah, so the Orphic, no, I skipped this, it's too much. I just want to point you to, if you have these optics, there are, especially in architecture theory, a lot of texts which actually do this. They would not describe themselves like that necessarily. But here, for example, this is for a seminar I'm going to teach in the winter semester. There is this book series, which was edited, I think, by AA. It's called Architecture Words. And it has collections of essays by architects. And this one here is a collection of essays that is summed up under the title, The House of Light and Entropy. And you can see here, this is a Sartre existentialism. Huh? Light and entropy. Why does it always have to be brought back to the entropy of the gravity? No, the lifting of the light is just as real. So, but still, and interestingly, what she does is she tries to find the language to address the complexity of landscapes in the US. And her claim is quite pragmatic. She says, the richness of landscapes in the US has not yet been addressed by architects. What would be the means in which we can do it? And it has very beautiful texts and fragments and kind of, then not these texts, then they become, in the sense of these muses, they become like yoga prescriptions. It's not, don't go into debate with them, no? It's silly if I start to be annoyed with her emphasis on entropy. Okay, so entropy it is for you. What can I learn? No, how do you move? What is beautiful about what you find now? So this is an essay writing style where through imitation, regardless whether you like it in the sense of this speaks to me, I recognize myself in it or not, it's quite mechanical. Okay, this is here today. Apparently it's important and I don't get it. So how can I imitate? Yeah. Or another one, and this is a beautiful story to end. It's from Max Bill. It's in the same book series. It's an essay collection entitled Form, Function, Beauty and Gestalt. And he has it's a very short, it's only 2 or 3 pages where he speaks about why I make jewelry from time to time. And the way that he addresses this is beautiful. So he says, for example, it's totally impossible to go look for the stones. They find you. So you can never plan. If somebody comes and says, can you make a piece of jewelry for me? I always, basically then he says, I know I cannot respect this person because he cannot appreciate what I can do. So you have all these kind of implications, no, in these kinds of decisions, which are brought into an essay form, not because he wants to be an arrogant asshole, but he also doesn't want to explain himself. No, it's like giving a construction, an auxiliary structure where it would be possible to learn to empathize or something like that. Empathy is not the right word. It's more learn to recognize under the assumption that I cannot know the feeling that he's talking about, but maybe I can learn to produce it myself or something similarly exciting, because obviously it's exciting because he makes fantastic stuff. No, so how is it possible? Why is he able to and not me, or differently than I am, or whatever? So there is a whole, I think, new attention to writing essays as a form of instructive treatises, but they will only work like that if we can somehow overcome this narcissistic humiliation in not wanting to imitate. But it's what I'm trying to do now, and I'm not fully convinced by what I'm saying. Huh? But I find it very attractive to invent how imitation can be kind of put in a different light. That was my talk. Thank you.